Today we're going to have a classic head-to-head battle with two different video cards. Now this is the machine that I'm going to use for this. Now although the sticker on the front says it's a Pentium 3, it is in fact not. So let's take it apart and have a look. So let's open it up and take a look. So this is in fact an Athlon 1.2 gig running with the 200 megahertz frontside bus and a Voodoo 5. So let's take out this card and also look at the other card that we're testing with today and have a look at them first. So here is the Voodoo 5 in all its glory. Now this has been a well-used card. The fans have long since died, so I did a bit of a hack job and replaced the fans. I didn't remove the heat sinks because that can be reasonably difficult with these cards, but I just screwed on some new fans. So this card works really well, and it's all just connected in via the Molex connector, so I just still only require the one Molex connector. So this is the Voodoo 5. Now, the other card that we're going to look at is in this anti-static wrapping. Now, I picked this one up off eBay very recently, actually, and it's perfect for this video because it is the exact right card, but it is basically brand new. This is the Geforce 2 GTS with 32 meg of RAM. So as you can see here, it is basically unused. It's a really nice looking card actually with the blue PCB. This is a gigabyte specific card. So we've got a reasonably decently powered CPU, so we shouldn't bottleneck these cards too much. I will run them at a higher resolution, and yeah, let's take a look. Before I continue, I've been looking at this power supply, and it's a 250 watt one, and now while fine when running this machine back in the day, it is definitely looks cheap and dodgy. The one issue with the Athlon CPUs is I believe they draw a lot of their power from the 5 volt rail. Now checking this power supply, it can supply 20 amps on the 5 watt rail. Now I've found a newer Corsair 550 watt power supply which will do 24 amps on the 5 volt rail. So I actually think that power supply is probably 10 years newer and would have been more expensive. So I'm going to swap the power supplies over before I continue. I also have a couple of rounded IDE cables, and I might try and clean this case up a little bit by swapping them over too. So we'll do that first. So unfortunately the specs of this one are actually slightly different to what was listed online, and it only has 18 amps on the 5 volt rail, whereas the old one has 20. So I'm still going to swap it because I think that'll be fine. But pretty much my understanding is that the Athlon and the video card will pretty much draw most of the power from the 5 volt rail. And unfortunately that's limited to 110 watts on this power supply. Now I am hoping that some stuff comes off the 12 volt rail, maybe a hard disk and things like that. But what I will do is I will jump into the BIOS and hopefully that'll give me a readout of the voltages so I can at least see if there's any dips on the 5 volt rail, but I think this is a safer bet than running this dodgy old Skyhawk power supply that's only 250 watts. So let's do that. this is useful. The area where you can clip on the extra 4-pin power has a little notch on the PSU connector, and as you can see, that hits the capacitor. So either I'm going to cut that off, which I think is what I'll do, and that should hopefully fit. So I will go do that. So that fits in perfectly now. And we are up and running. For this computer, I'm using a Gigabyte 7i XE4. I actually purchased this exact motherboard back in the day with a Duron 800, which was a great machine, an upgrade from my Pentium 133 at the time. So we'll just fire up CPU Z and have a quick look at the motherboard and CPU info. But yeah, as I said before, I love Windows 2000. Even though it may not be the perfect operating system for these benchmarks, it's been very reliable, and both Geforce and Voodoo cards have good support for this operating system.
Winner. It really whips the llama's ass.
So let's get into the benchmarks. So the first benchmark results from Quake 3 at 1024 by 768 in 32-bit color. The Geforce and the Voodoo both produce a nice high frame rate here, so both very playable. But the Geforce 2 is 23% faster, so quite a big step up. Now the Geforce 2 does have the TNL engine, which does help in Quake 3. It actually does quite a big difference if you've got lower CPU performance, but in this case I think for the Athlon 1.2 gig it should provide sufficient speed for both these. So that's quite a good win for the Geforce. So let's move on to the 1280 by 1024 results. Now this kind of surprised me a little bit. I expected the results to be closer, but we now have a 28% increase to the Geforce 2. I expected with the higher resolutions the memory bandwidth would help because they both run effectively the same memory bandwidth, but potentially the scaling with the SLI doesn't work as well because it has to copy the textures between the two banks of memory. So yeah, I was a little bit surprised that the Geforce 2 did so much better here. So pushing playability at this rate on the Voodoo 5, look, 49 frames is fine for most people, but you really want to try and hit that 60 mark. So the Geforce 2 here is definitely the right choice for Quake 3 at higher resolutions. The results here in 3D Mark 2000 aren't really a surprise. It is definitely heavily biased to Geforce and Nvidia cards with the hardware TNL engine, and it's also a direct 3D game, which the Nvidia cards have always done very well in. So a 50% increase is not good for the Voodoo 5, but not unexpected. I do think if you put in a very fast CPU, you would close the gap a bit, but yeah, this is pretty much what you would expect in 3D Mark for these video cards. Three D Mark 2001 is even more strenuous on these video cards, and unfortunately the Voodoo is really not keeping up with it. Now, potentially if 3dfx were still around when 3D Mark 2001 was released, they could have optimized it with driver improvements, but yeah, we're almost getting double the performance on the Geforce 2. So pretty disappointing, but again, in line with what we would expect for this kind of benchmark. I was a bit surprised by the Serious Sam results. The Geforce 2 is 53% faster than the Voodoo 5. I expected the Voodoo 5 to perform better because this is an OpenGL game, but obviously the Serious Sam engine prefers the Geforce architecture. Again, I'm sure the hardware TNL is helping, but I also think just the general raw performance of the GPU in the Geforce is enough to make this a bit of a bloodbath here. So not a great result for the Voodoo, although it still produces a playable game and looks quite nice. And the final benchmark here is Half-Life 1, and it is the first win for the Voodoo 5, and surprisingly it is quite a substantial increase over the Geforce 2. Now, Half-Life 1 is a lot older game than some of the other games we've tested, and obviously it has underpinnings in Glide originally, so I suppose it's not a huge surprise. I actually did think the Geforce 2 would perform better here, but if you're playing old Glide games and old games that are based around those engines, then the Voodoo 5 is obviously the preference here. I'm sure it would be the same if we looked at Unreal Tournament as well. So yeah, good win here for the Voodoo 5, producing a very nice 76 frames a second. Now, I wanted to do some power draw readings because the Voodoo 5 obviously has double the amount of memory and double the video chips. So I was expecting it to draw quite a lot more power than the Geforce 2. Looking at idle, yeah, it's only about a 6% increase. Now this is total system draw, so we are looking at, a 6.5 watt increase. But the Voodoo 5, I believe each chip is kind of rated at about 15 watts. So obviously in idle it's not using all that power, but yeah, only a 6% increase, so not as significant as I would have thought. So now looking at the power usage while we're running Quake 3, we can see that the difference between the GPUs has actually dropped, which I was surprised. So only 3.5% increase when using the Voodoo 5. So in the grand scheme of things, the Voodoo 5 does not use that much more power than the Geforce 2. Now this is only a basic test and just reading the entire system usage. So we'd have to look at it in more detail if we wanted to really see what the actual video card was using. So the percentage increase, if you just measured each video card, would be a lot higher. But when you're looking at total system draw, it is not a big deal. When I was looking at these results, though, pushing the 140 watts total draw, I really think that the power supply I've got in there is probably a little bit underpowered. I am a little nervous about drawing that much, simply because I don't know how much is getting pulled off the 5-volt rail, and I suspect the majority of it is, and the power supply is only rated for 110 watts on the 5-volt rail. So I will definitely in future look for a better power supply. So from the benchmarks, we can see the Voodoo 5 does quite well in older games such as Half-Life 1, and to some extent Quake 3. Unfortunately, with newer games that use Direct 3D or hardware transform and lighting, or simply newer games, it really struggles. So 3D Mark 2000, 2001 and Serious Sam, it definitely could not keep up anywhere near the Geforce 2. Now, I thought that at some higher resolutions this card would perform better because it does have the same memory bandwidth as the Geforce 2, and you would think that with the two VSA 100 chips running at 166 MHz, those would outperform a single CPU from Nvidia. But as we've seen from our previous benchmarks with the Voodoo 3, the Voodoo architecture megahertz for megahertz is just not quite as fast as the Nvidia equivalent. Now, this card really needed to come out about 6 months after the Voodoo 3 to really succeed in the market. So the Geforce 1 came out in October 99, and that was about 6 or 7 months after the Voodoo 3. So really this needed to be competing with the Geforce 256. Even the Geforce 256 DDR can compete with this and beat it in a lot of circumstances. Now, from these results, I do think a faster CPU would still give us better performance. It definitely, because of the lack of transform and lighting, it does like a fast CPU. So although the Athlon 1.2 is very period correct, it probably could use with a faster CPU. But I like to see how things were back in the day, and that sort of lines up with what you probably would have been running. So you can see the difference. Now, even though the Voodoo 5 was late, it was still rushed to market from internal 3dfx development. People have said online that this particular Voodoo 5 is actually more like a prototype board that got released to retail. So as you can see here, it's only got the AGP 2X standard, and it doesn't have things like DVI. But they did release to a small subset of customers, I think it was an OEM board, this version of the Voodoo 5. Now, as you can see here, this has the 4X AGP slot, even though it still can't run at 4X. But you can see that the board is quite a lot shorter and looks a bit more similar to the Voodoo 4. So, yes, even though this Voodoo 5 was quite late, it was still rushed. And really, if 3dfx had spent more time on development and got the board out 6 months earlier, more like 7 or 8 months out earlier, it would have definitely had a better chance in the market. And it's weird because, 6 or 7 months doesn't sound like a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But back then, Nvidia was releasing new chips every 6 months, and they were just the better process manufacturing, better memory, more features, and 3dfx simply couldn't keep up. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I think in future we'll do some further testing with Voodoo 4s and Geforce 2 MXs and see how they go, and we'll go from there. Thanks, guys.